So we're working our way through this big old book called Chronicles, and it is ancient. And I get, if you're new to church particularly, you might consider us slightly mad for taking time to read a book that was written so many thousand years ago to people who lived so many thousands of miles away. But our experience of this book, even if it's been the first time reading it, is, even though it's ancient, it is alive. And even though it's ancient, it's been active amongst us. And actually, we need to understand, although the Bible is not written to us, it has been written down for us. And one of the ways that, even though it's written down for people who lived a long way away from us, one of the ways it starts to feel closer to us is by understanding the situation of those original readers. Now, we've done that a little bit as we've worked our way through Chronicles. But we're going to see three more ways this morning that, even though they're miles from us, they're actually not that unlike us. Let me rattle through them now and then we'll come back to them. The first thing about these people is, they were people who were battling with a kind of kingless hole in their lives. For them, there was something missing, someone who was absent that left this vulnerability within them and left them feeling kind of rudderless. They had a kingless hole. As well as that, they were carrying within them this kind of guilty soul. They had a conscience in them that no matter how much they tried to quiet it and dull it and excuse it, they couldn't quite suppress it. There was an inescapable guilt within them. And the third thing that's not that far from us is that they were facing an overwhelming role. They had a task that had been presented before them that had left them feeling like it was beyond their own capacity, way out with their own resources, and maybe like some of us, leaves us prone to running away or maybe self-sabotage. So, three things: kingless hole, guilty soul, overwhelming role. And actually, all of a sudden, they're not quite that far away from us. And so my prayer has been that this week, and as we continue to work our way through this book of Chronicles, and it is a big prayer, but there is a sense in which God would continue to fill us whole, wash us clean, and make us powerfully new. That's the prayer for today. And here's how we're going to do it. If you were here last week, you remember we looked at three questions, and we said the point of those three questions was to tether us down when we're in the midst of tough transitions. Vague memories of that stuff last week. Now, that was good because sometimes when you are finding life tough, you do need things that never change to tether you down. However, when life is tough, you also need things that kind of transform you to show that you don't need to be stuck where you are. And so that's what I want to show us this morning. We're going to see three movements that bring a kind of transformative hope when you feel stuck. The movements are going to be different. We're going to see from one king to another king. We're going to go from the outside of the temple to the inside of the temple. And then we're going to go from something really old to something that is powerfully new. All right? That's the three movements we're going to see. Maybe. All right? In the game? Okay, here's movement number one. One king to another. We've seen a movement from David to Solomon that is going to show us that we need the wisdom of an incomparable king. All right? From David to Solomon to show us we need the wisdom of an incomparable king. So, we've said this is written to a people who had just been invaded, overcome, and then deported to an enemy nation called Babylon. And it's written to them when they've just, after 70 years of being there, been allowed to return home. But although they are returning home, as we said, they're returning with this kingless hole in them. They are like a team without a manager. They are elves without Santa. They're sheep without a shepherd. There's this missing thing within them. And we've said a king in Chronicles isn't like our king who's kind of all pomp and pageantry. A king back then was about real power and was about real protection. If you had a kingless hole in your life, you were vulnerable and rudderless, gasping for both protection and direction. So here's these people, kingless hole, and in this chapter, particularly chapter 1 of 2 Chronicles, he's in great detail showing you this movement from King David to King Solomon. At the end of the last chapter, David dies, and Solomon has just taken the throne. And what's interesting about the way he displays Solomon is, he displays him as absolutely glorious and almost perfectly flawless. Remember that old song? Absolutely flawless. Was that a song? Was that a song? I made that up. I reckon if Daniel was here, he would have known that song. But that's how Solomon's presented. He's absolutely glorious. He's almost perfectly flawless. If you look at chapter 1, verses 1 to 6, the first thing he does is he worships God, a model king. God then comes and he appears to him in a dream, and he gives him a kind of blank check prayer. Ask for anything you want. Solomon, from the depths of his heart, asks God, in this moment of worship, for wisdom. Model king. Because he asked for wisdom, God says, you know what, I'm going to throw in wealth for the deal, just because you've been so integral in asking for wisdom. And from there, in chapter 2, this wise, wealthy king who's worshipped God becomes a king who witnesses to the entire world. A king from Tyre, a godless nation, starts to worship Solomon's God and help with the building of the temple. Worship, wealth, witness, and wisdom. A model king, incomparable. There's never been wisdom like this before. There's never been wealth like this before. There's never been a witness to the world like this before. Absolutely flawless. Someone going, what's that thing called? Shazam. I'm sure that's a song. But here's what now. Here's the problem with this, and let me into a little secret, particularly if you're new to the Bible. Solomon's presented in this way here. See in the rest of the Bible, he's really not that. He wrote a book in the Bible all about wisdom, but he becomes unbelievably foolish. And you're left going, what the heck is that about? He writes a book on the ecstasy and the beauty of faithfulness within marriage, and then he ends up having 300 wives and 700 living lovers. The heck is that? Model king? And you start to look at Chronicles and you go, is this guy like is he Matt Hancock's PR guy? He's trying to fill the airwaves and the columns with good stuff to try and cancel out all the nonsense that's going on. Is that what's going on in Chronicles? It's not. Let me tell you why. Remember, this people have this kingless hold. They're at this position where they've returned from being under an enemy king, and they're returning to their homeland with no king. Why is the writer presenting to us Solomon in this kind of idealistic way? He is not presenting them in this way, in this movement from David to Solomon, simply to fill their heads with a kind of photoshopped history. He's using this movement from David to Solomon to preach to them about their need for an incomparable king. He's not just trying to fill their heads with history. He wants to fill their hearts with hope. He's trying to raise their heads in a moment where they are drooping low and saying, when you have a kingless hole, this is the thing that you need to long for and look out for. A king who will be incomparable. A king who will witness to the world because he has a wealth of wisdom that will make people bow down and worship him. As we start the service, the writer of Chronicles is saying to this people, through this photoshopped picture of Solomon, you need to long for what will become a reality in King Jesus. You will see a king in all this beauty. It wasn't Solomon, but there's one coming who is. He's saying to them, what you lack now will be found in Jesus. Without him, you are vulnerable and rudderless. With him, you will be protected and directed. You're waiting for Solomon but better. Solomon but greater. Because the reality was, you looked at Solomon's life for 2 seconds and you would have found his flaws. They're mentioned nowhere in Chronicles. Here's the incomparable thing about Jesus. You can look at his life for as long as you want. You'll never find a flaw. Never. The people who were closest to him and were commissioned by him said things like, he knew no sin and he knew all things. Incomparable. His enemies couldn't catch him out with their questions and couldn't answer his questions, and it took collective lies, a bent courtroom, and a rigged trial to convict him. He's incomparable. King Jesus will be the one who is wisdom from God, the wisdom of God, the one in whom are found all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. The photoshopped Solomon will become a reality in the person of Jesus Christ. Now, what's it saying to us? This movement from David to Solomon, kind of painted in this ideal way, is saying, you need a king who will use his strength to protect you when you are weak. You need a king who will use his wisdom to lead you out of your foolishness. I don't know if you ever feel that hole within you, someone missing, feeling vulnerable and rudderless. Another song, one that actually existed, we got taught growing up in church, was David Luther this one. Life without Jesus is like a donut, like a donut. No one heard that song either. Nobody ever heard these songs. And then it went, life without Jesus is like a donut. There's a hole in the middle of your heart. Yeah, maybe it wasn't known for good reason. But the reality is, we try and fill that hole with people and purposes and products, but that hole is hungry, isn't it? And the reality is, to fill that hole, you need an incomparable king who will use the wealth of his wisdom to protect you and lead you into his wisdom. The point of this movement from David to an idealistic Solomon is to say to you, what you lack, you will only find in King Jesus. And the movement you need to make to find transformative hope in your life is a movement towards him and to bow before him. All right? Movement number 1. From David to Solomon, you need the wisdom of an incomparable king. Here's the second one. Movement 2 is a movement from outside to inside. And the point of this movement is to show you that you cannot dwell in the house of the uncontainable God. A movement from the outside to the inside to show you cannot be at home in the house of the uncontainable God. So, again, just to remind ourselves, this is a nation who've been enslaved, carted off to Babylon. They've just returned, but they're not just returning kingless. They're returning guilty. They weren't just invaded and conquered as victims by an enemy nation. They were invaded as a punishment by the faithfulness of God. Actually, right at the end of Chronicles, this is how it's described. You don't have to turn there. This is chapter 36, verse 14. It says, all the leaders of the priests and the people became more and more unfaithful, following all the detestable practices of the nations, defiling the temple of the Lord, which he had consecrated in Jerusalem. The Lord, the God of their ancestors, sent word to them through his messengers again and again, because he had pity on his people and his dwelling place. But They mocked the messengers, despised his words, scoffed at his prophets, until the wrath of the Lord was aroused against his people, and there was no remedy. You see that cycle? Sinning and sinning and sinning. God has pity and more pity and more pity, but they respond with scoffing, despising, and mocking. And God's wrath is aroused, and he says, for you, no remedy. We talked at the start again. Remember that feeling of having a conscience which knows it's guilty but can't seem to shift the shame. This is why we need this second movement. First from one king to another. This movement is then from the inside of the outside of the temple to the inside. A lot of these chapters are Solomon building this temple. So if you look at chapter 2, verse 1, he gives orders to start. Chapter 2, verse 3 starts to gather the resources to make it happen. Chapter 3, verse 1, the building project starts. And then by chapter 5, verse 1, we're told everything's finished. But here's the interesting thing. The way it's described is not, like most building projects, where you would say, we're going to see something build up. The way it's described here is a movement from outside in. So if you look at chapter 3, verse 4, it starts in the portico. I guess as most of our houses don't have porticos, we'd probably call it a porch, right? So that first inside movement, the portico. You then go into the main hall, and then by chapter 3, verse 8, you are in what is called the most holy place. Here's what you're being told. You are being drawn into God's house. From the outside, portico, through the main hall, right into the heart of the most holy place. And just like our houses reflect us, God's house, we're told, reflects him. So if you just scan kind of chapter 2 and 3, you'll see over and over you're told everything's overlaid with gold, or there's a decoration of gold. It's saying he's glorious. If you look at chapter 2, verse 6, Solomon says something about God. He says, who is able to build a temple for him, since the heavens, even the highest heavens, cannot contain him? This is God's house, but it's not his house. You can't contain him here. He's so glorious, he's bigger than anything, the heavens even. That's why everything's gold. But as well as gold reflecting his glory, there's loads of detail here that reflects that he is holy. Two massive details in the most holy place. Have a look at chapter 3, verse 8. The first thing you see in the most holy place are the sculptures of two absolutely massive bodyguard angels. Now, we tend to think angels as beautiful little girls. Angels here are beastly bodyguards. To call someone an angel is not necessarily a compliment. You look like the bodyguard or a bouncer outside of a club, and that was the point of them. In the most holy place, in this temple, these two cherubim beastly bodyguards have a combined wingspan of 10 meters. They are massive. And they are like bodyguards at a club that are saying, dependent on your nature and your behavior, you cannot come in here. They're cherubim. They're the same things that guarded the way back to the Garden of Eden when God had bounced Adam and Eve out because of their rebellion against him. You're barred. The other thing, if you look at chapter 3, verse 14, as well as these kind of bodyguard cherubims in the heart of the temple, is this massive curtain. Chapter 3, verse 14. It's big, it's thick, it's tall, and again, it's to keep people out. And just in case you missed the kind of point, do you notice what's worked into the detail of the curtain? Chapter 3, verse 14. More cherubim. More bodyguards. It's a mad thing, right? You are being drawn from the outside to the inside of the house, but for the purpose of being told, you cannot come into this house. The further you get in, the more you are told, you do not belong. so much that's written here is to show us that we are rebels who deserve no remedy. Now, at the start I said, today these are going to be movements that hopefully bring some kind of transformative hope. At the moment, this one maybe feels like you're trapped rather than transformed. I'm being told I'm a rebel with no remedy. But here's the thing we need to understand. The first step towards transformation is a recognition and an admission that you need to be transformed. For a doctor to prescribe you with the right remedy, they first have to get an accurate diagnosis. And this movement into the very heart of the house of God is giving you God's accurate diagnosis of your life. We are rebels against God, and from ourselves there is no remedy. Now, we can spend a lot of our emotional lives trying to excuse ourselves of blame and trying to shift it from us onto other people. We can get a lot of help from that, from friends and family, and sometimes even counselors who want to help us point the finger at other people and say that we are more victims of our consequences than rebels who have had choices. Now, there's always a mix. It's always complicated. But God is clear here in his diagnosis of every single one of us. We are rebels against his authority, and from ourselves there is no remedy. Now, like a doctor, one of the kindest things God can do for us today is rightly diagnose us today. We have rebellious souls. And actually that, if you think back to the first point, sometimes we try and fill that rebellious, kingless hole by being our own king, thinking we can save ourselves. What's the issue with that? I cannot be the answer to my own problems if I am part of the problem. I need an incomparable king who will deal with my rebellious soul. So, first movement, one king to another. We need this king. Part of the reason why, from the outside to the inside of the temple, is because we are rebels with no remedy. And here's the final movement. Movement number 3. We're going to go from ancient ground to new creation. And I want us to see here the provision of a forgiving and faithful God. All right? Final movement from ancient to new, and the provision of a forgiving, faithful God. The question I hope is burning in you is going, if I'm a rebel, there's no remedy. What hope is that? Where's transformation going to come from? Now, there are some hints in some of the stuff that's in the temple. Altars, basins. But actually the biggest clue is not the stuff in the temple, but the site of the temple. Have a look at chapter 3, verse 1. We're going to read this. Then Solomon began to build the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem on, here's the site of it, Mount Moriah, where the Lord had appeared to his father David. So the site of the temple they're building is on Mount Moriah. Now that here takes us back a little bit in time to Solomon's dad, David, where David met with God and promised him this land, and so David buys it as a threshing floor. And that's where Solomon's going to build the temple. However, in your Bibles, Mount Moriah has come back much earlier on. Mount Moriah was the place where God tested Abraham and asked him to sacrifice his only son Isaac on an altar. And on Mount Moriah, Abraham acts in faith, binds his son, his only son, on an altar, and raises the knife to sacrifice his one and only son. Imagine the emotions of that moment. But as he raises the knife, he hears the voice of God saying, "Stop." And the voice of God on Mount Moriah points him to a ram that is caught in a thicket, in a bush. And God tells him that on this altar that ought to have been his son, the ram will be slain so that Isaac's life can be spared. Imagine how Abraham's feeling in that moment. And in the relief and the rejoicing of that ram substitute, do you know what Abraham calls Mount Moriah? He says he calls this place, "The Lord will provide." That's the place where the temple is built. It is the place where the Lord provides a substitute in the stead of someone else being slain. And so in the very place where Isaac's heart is spared and continues to beat, becomes the beating heart of the temple. The foundation of the temple land is "The Lord will provide." It's looking back to Abraham and Isaac, where God provided the ram who would die for Abraham's one and only son. But it's also looking forward to Jesus, God's one and only son, who would be sacrificed as a substitute to be the remedy for rebel sinners. Isn't it beautiful how the whole Bible just works? That's what's happening when Jesus dies on the cross. He is being barred from God's house so that you actually might be welcomed home. He is being forsaken so that you can be forgiven. He is being dirtied by our sin so that we can be washed clean. That's why when Jesus dies, the temple curtain that is detailed with cherubim is torn from top to bottom. It is saying to you, well, it's actually saying to the cherubim, stand down. They can come up. That is how, if you trust in Jesus as your substitute and you bow to him as your king, when you die, you won't meet a curtain and a cherubim that bars you to hell. You will meet Christ who welcomes you to heaven. And there might be some people here this morning going, yeah, but my sin runs deep. And it goes back long. But you need to see how ancient God goes back. All the way to Mount Moriah, where this place has for a long time been called, "The Lord will provide." His provision goes back further and deeper than your rebellion. He provides a remedy no one else can. Now, last thing I want to say, because we've not moved yet, we're just on ancient ground, and this is going to be quick. But there's a beautiful movement here that I didn't notice, had to be helped to see it, where we go from ancient ground to new creation. Now remember we said, these people weren't just kingless, they're not just guilty, they're overwhelmed. Solomon builds this massive temple, it takes him years, it's stunning in gold, it's prominent in the city, and so when the Babylonians take over their land, what do you think the Babylonians do to impress their power upon the Israelite people? You knock it down. And they did. And so when God's people return, they don't face a glorious holy temple, they face the rubble of a temple. And the overwhelming task before them is rebuild. Now, here's the movement. Ancient ground to new creation. There's a beautiful thing in this text, where the way that the temple is described in its construction maps almost perfectly onto the way that it's described in Genesis, that God makes creation as a whole. When God makes creation in Genesis chapter 1, In the first 3 days, he forms spaces. And then in the second 3 days, he fills those spaces. And then on the seventh day, he's finished. So day 1, he forms the space of light. Day 2, he forms the spaces of the air and the sea. And then on day 3, he forms the space of the land. Then in the next 3 days, he fills those spaces. So he fills on day 4 the light with the sun, the moon, and the stars. He fills the sky on day 4 with birds and the sea with kind of swimming things. And then on day 6, he fills the ground with animals and humanity. The spaces he forms in the first 3 days, he fills in the second 3 days, and then on day 7, he is finished. Formed, filled, finished. That was creation. Guess what happens in this building of the temple? He forms 3 spaces: portico, main hall, most holy place. Then guess what he does? He fills those 3 spaces with furnishings. Then guess what he does? Chapter 5, verse 1. Same word as Genesis chapter 2. Finished. Why is he doing that? I think what the point he's making is when you feel overwhelmed at the task of building a new temple, you need to see it's going to take God to do something that comes from nothing. We can't do it. It will take the incomparable, uncontainable God to do what he's always done and bring everything from nothing. In some ways, you could read this chapter and go, Solomon builds a temple, Solomon furnishes a temple, Solomon finished the temple. Where did the wisdom come from to do it? God. Where did the wealth come from to do it? God. Where did the help from the nations come from to do it? God. It takes new creation for God's people to face and to do anything. So, I don't know if you feel overwhelmed. I think in this last week, I felt as overwhelmed as I ever have at what lies before us in Graceman. The needs in our own lives, the complex, deep, long ingrained needs in our community are overwhelming. Our hope is not in us. New things, building things, growing things will not come from us, but from this ancient ground where the Lord provides. He brings a movement to new creation. And that's important for all of us. We are not the help you need. You need to turn to God and not to us. Recovery is not what you need. Resurrection is what you need. New creation is what you need. Here is the good thing. The Lord who provides from the ancient place has the power to do new creation things. And so, as a church, we will always stand on the ancient ground of Calvary, trusting that it will be from there that God will bring renewal and revival and recreation amongst us and in our community. The Lord always has, always will provide. Isn't that good news? We need the wisdom of an incomparable King. We so need the remedy that comes from the uncontainable God. And we need him to bring new creation because there's no hope to be found anywhere else.